Hello, and welcome to this week's session on sustaining change, evaluation, and then exiting. This is really the end of the OD process, and so I thought it might be worth our while to spend a moment to kind of review where we've been in our conversation about the OD process. And so the first step, if you recall, is entering and contracting. Of course, in that step, we're really trying to determine things like who's the relevant client. We're also trying to negotiate with the client the scope of the work that's going to be done, the expectations, and also trying to really sort of perhaps get the client to appreciate the OD approach. All right, that's the first step, and so then the second step is the process of diagnosis, and once again the primary question there is really our attempt to get at the underlying problem so that we might be able to choose the most appropriate form of intervention. Then the third phase of the OD process is actually engaging in the OD intervention. To that effect, we've talked about really OD interventions existing at three different levels: the level of the individual, then the level of the team, and then with our last session we talked about whole organization types of interventions, which then brings us to really the fourth step in the process, and that's what we're talking about here, the process by which you sustain whatever changes that have been made. You spend some time kind of reflecting on the effectiveness of that change, and then ultimately you say your goodbyes. You exit the organization, hopefully having left it in a better position than it was in when you first initially enter the organization. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this session. That is the processes of how do you sustain the change, keep the momentum going, how do you evaluate that change, and then how do you exit. So let's begin with talking about sustaining the change. Given our other sessions, we've discovered that oftentimes creating change can be pretty difficult. But one of the things that we oftentimes realize is that after all of our hard labors to bring about the change, we tend to see that after only a short while after we've left, that the members might in fact revert back to the previous things that they were doing before we ever sort of made this engagement. So let's talk about why this tends to be the case. Your book gives you a number of reasons for this. One is that obviously without the change agent there to look over the shoulders of people, it's no longer really being given the kind of attention that it was when there was someone there kind of watching over the shoulders. Another reason has to do with that you've kind of lost the gusto. You've lost a little bit of the energy and the motivation for that change. And once again, without someone constantly being the cheerleader, you're now losing the kind of energy and dedication to the process. A third reason may be that somewhere along the way, the process has gotten to the point to where the skills that are needed to see it through are not there. Perhaps there's not been enough follow through with training, or like I said, the process just really got beyond the skills that people needed. So we no longer possess the skills to sustain the change that was made. This fourth one, I think, is probably the biggest doozy, and that is culture. If you recall, in our former sessions, we really talked about how culture can be one of those things that's tremendously underestimated. And in this case, it can be a tremendous hindrance. In other words, after you've made the change, people are sort of thrust back into the larger organizational cultural context in which that culture now continues to push people back into their old ways of doing things. So people tend to revert back to the old patterns because there's been no culture change in that case. So these are all things that can in fact hinder the momentum that has been made in the initial change. So let's talk about some of the things that you can do to perhaps counter some of these things that tend to hinder change. So there are a variety of different mechanisms for sustaining change that any potential committee might really want to consider. And once again, you want to consider this stuff at the planning stage of the intervention, not as a post hoc tack on at the end of the project. So one thing to plan for are periodic team meetings in which people come back and they spend some time talking about the momentum for sustaining the change. Another thing is sort of the idea of having this sort of organization sensing meetings. This is discussed in your book, but this is a process whereby top leadership specifically spend some time just sort of getting a sense of kind of how people are sort of reacting and responding to the changes that have been made. Periodic intergroup meetings, right? If you remember the idea of sort of having these sort of conferences that were discussed in the last session, right? This is where you might have something like that again, in which you bring back groups and you allow them to kind of dialogue once again about maybe any kind of intergroup changes that were made. Renewal conferences, right? Once again, if you did something in terms of the whole organization conferences that we talked about, some of these search conferences, right, then you would want to bring people back periodically into those types of conferences just to kind of address, and evaluate what the outcomes were from the last conferences. Goal-directed performance reviews. Okay. And this is just making sure that there are opportunities for departments and or individuals to really come back and actually be somewhat accountable, if you will, for the performances that should have hopefully resulted from some of these change initiatives. Another thing is simply to have periodic visits from outside consultants, particularly if the change was managed by an outside consultant. Then that person kind of serves in this sort of capacity of holding people accountable for sticking to whatever commitments that they've made. And so, having planned visits for outside consultants to come back and kind of do a little bit of accountability hearing oftentimes tends to motivate people to kind of make sure that they're not slipping with the change. And then perhaps sort of the final thing to consider is the reward structure. And this really gets to the idea of making sure that any changes that were enacted are in fact being firmly institutionalized into the organization. And one of the places, not the only place, to really begin thinking about that is in the reward system. In other words, are people going to be compensated for whatever new practices or new behaviors that they now have to engage? I mean, one of the ways in which you can definitely kill any kind of change endeavor is not to begin to recognize and reward people for any kind of new pattern behavior that you actually expect them to engage in. And so spending some time to really think about what kind of reward mechanisms are going to be in place are important, because these are the kind of things that we need to kind of reinforce any behaviors that we're doing. So let's now turn and talk a little bit about evaluation, right? So we've talked about issues around sustaining momentum. Now let's talk about how do we actually spend some time evaluating effectiveness. This is a quote that's taken from your book that I thought you might want to make sure that you highlight, and that is the idea that the evaluation process can oftentimes be kind of compared to that annual physical examination that you do with your doctor, right? We all know that we ought to do it, right? But nobody really wants to do it in that case there, except for that highly motivated researcher who then wants to go to the trouble and expense of making it happen, right? So in that sense, taking some time to evaluate the effectiveness of OD is one of the things that we know we ought to do. We know that in theory, right? But oftentimes there's a little bit less of a motivation to actually want to carefully plan and do this. And once again, it's important that this gets to be a part of the planning process rather than sort of an afterthought, because if it's an afterthought, it's less likely to be something that people actually are going to do. And so there are a number of things that can be evaluated. I think your book actually provides some fairly helpful figures that you might sort of want to look at in terms of determining what kind of variables might be enacted. For example, on pages 318 and 319, figures 13.1 and 13.2, I think these are sort of nice little wheels, if you will, to add to your toolkit. But just to sort of give you somewhat of a listing of some of these things, right, you could look at sort of either individual or team productivity. You could look at a variety of different forms of satisfaction, the primary one being sort of job satisfaction. Typically that includes things like satisfaction with coworkers, satisfaction with managers, right? One of the more famous job satisfaction scales also include things like satisfaction with promotability, satisfaction with supervision, as well as even satisfaction with the actual nature of the work that one does. Things like belief in the organization's success might be very important. Measures of conflict resolution or team role clarification. Some more bottom line things like revenue, or even looking at satisfaction from key stakeholders like customer satisfaction. Work quality might be important to do, particularly if you're engaging in any of the performance measures that we talked about in some of our previous sessions, things like total quality management, for example. And then, you might be very much interested in being able to assess, some sense of individual or team learning, right? All of these would represent some examples of either process and or outcome variables that one might consider evaluating. And the process that one would go through in the evaluation stage is very much like some of the same kind of issues that we addressed when we talked about the diagnosis phase. So issues around methodology, issues around how does one sort of analyze the data using, hopefully some combination of both qualitative as well as quantitative statistical tools in which to do that. So let's look at some evaluation practice tips that you want to consider. And that is to see evaluation as both a summative, looking back, if you will, and a formative, looking forward data gathering effort. Summative typically focuses on just sort of the overall effectiveness. How effective has this program been? So it's summative in the sense that you're really just sort of summarizing where you've been. Perhaps just as important is the idea of formative evaluation. Presumably this is preliminary data that you're collecting that helps you to even make improvements to the program or the process even while you're still engaging it. So this formative really becomes important because it helps you to improve the very process that you're going through. So you definitely don't want to wait to the end before you discover that you did it all wrong. Formative evaluation would be something that would give you some preliminary insight in terms of how the program is going. And so in evaluation language, you'll see this division between summative and formative quite a lot. You also want to make sure, as with the whole OD approach in general, that your key stakeholders are having success in the initiative, right? And therefore you also want them to have a voice in the evaluation. Once again, they may not have the knowledge, skills, and or abilities to be, good at choosing research methodology or choosing statistical tools, but where I've found stakeholders to definitely have valuable input is even in choosing what research questions that you're going to look at. Right, they definitely have a stake in the kinds of information or the kinds of outcome information that's going to be important. And also, you want to ask the client, what will you do with the results? Right, and of course, you want to ask that question even in the planning phase. Becomes important because you want them to think about the practical implications of your data. This is oftentimes called the so what. Right? So in the event that you find that this program has been successful, then so what? Right? It might get them thinking about, ways in which they might present this information to, funders or perhaps additional funders, or how they might sort of present this information to clients, what new programs that they might sort of venture into if they can demonstrate that what they've been doing is a success. So this is an important question to get clients to think about. You clearly want to identify the objectives during the contracting phase. So once again, you can see the importance of that first step in the OD process. Right? Any objectives that you identified and that you agreed are important, these are definitely the kind of things that you want to make sure that you spend some time kind of revisiting in your evaluation activities. And of course, you want to use a combination of evaluation methods, both qualitative and quantitative. And I think this is very important, that is that you want to tailor your evaluation. The idea of having some off-the-shelf evaluation package, I think, is quite stale. Every intervention, every client's different, right? Every intervention is probably going to call for different kinds of research questions. Different clients have their preferences in terms of what they find interesting, and so you want to make sure that the evaluation effort is truly tailored for that client and that intervention. And you want to maintain a success story file. If you recall, our conversations earlier about the notion of appreciative inquiry. In fact, some of you folks have come across some of the appreciative inquiry in the blogs that you found. Right, this is that opportunity to kind of keep track of the success stories. And by this I'm referring to the success stories of the program that you've been enacting. And so, definitely case, you don't want to wait until the end. Clearly, if you're engaging in this formative evaluation that I mentioned at the top of this, right, then you're going to be collecting data along the way. But I also think that this speaks to a very important part of evaluation. That is that, it's very helpful if evaluation doesn't become another thing that people have to do. People are already overburdened by the day-to-day ebbs and flows of their jobs, and so if evaluation can be built into the normal flow of what people are doing, then it will seem to be a little bit less interruptive to what they're doing, and therefore it'll be, it'll seem normal, if you will. And so obviously that means that you'll be conducting evaluation in a very more continual process while the program is ongoing, rather than, once again, something that you wait and do at the very end. Okay. All right. So we've talked about the evaluation process. Let's sort of shift very quickly now and talk about the whole ending process. As with most personal relationships, breaking up is hard to do. We're generally better at beginning relationships than we actually are at ending them. And so most relationships oftentimes end on less than favorable notes. And so, but I think as an OD consultant, as with everything else, you do want to spend some time thinking about how the relationship should in fact end. So I think it's important to keep in mind that consulting is a temporary relationship. Right? All engagements must come to an ethical end. And so the question becomes, so why are we emphasizing this idea of ethical? Because I think that as an OD consultant, you are concerned with ethics from the day you first shake hands with the client, or perhaps the day you first get the phone call, to the day that you exit those doors from the very end. And how you leave can oftentimes be one of the more vulnerable places for making ethical violations. So staying too long, to the point to where you're developing a mutual dependency. Remember that the goal of an OD consultant is to work yourself out of a job. And so if you're simply creating a dependency of the client upon you, then you're obviously not achieving that aims. On the other hand, if you're in a situation where you are too dependent upon that client financially, then it can be quite exploitive. On the other hand, if you separate too soon, right, you're leaving the clients before they've actually developed the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need to be able to continue on their own. And so there's sort of that delicate balance between, not wanting to stay too long, but also not wanting to leave too soon. So the question is, how do you know when it's time to end? Well, one is obviously when the work is done, when the contract has been concluded, or when the results have been met. That's a clear indicator that it's time to go. But there might be other indicators. So, for example, when you notice that the interest on the part of the client has begun to wane, right? People are beginning to miss meetings. There's delay, right? There's obvious sort of boredom on the part of the client. When people begin neglecting commitments, and that's both the consultant as well as the client, right? These are sort of, telling signs, indicators, if you will, that perhaps it's time to end this relationship, before some serious damage gets done. And another thing is, the consultant wants the outcomes more than the client, right? When it becomes clear that the consultant is the only person driving this initiative, then it's really probably an indicator to the consultant that it's probably time to end the relationship. And then finally, an ending tip. I think it's helpful if you have an ending meeting, right? Many organizations, for example, have what are called exit interviews, right? When someone is seeking to leave the organization, usually on a voluntary basis, it helps to have kind of that debriefing. Sometimes you actually learn more about your organization from the exit interviews than you do from anything else that you want to do. And so you can have something like this as a consultant, where you would spend some time, and it would allow you to sort of get some feedback on the part of the client. Weisbord's notion, it's better clean death than lingering agony, right? Which definitely anyone who's had any experience working with organizations can truly appreciate the concept of lingering agony. But conducting an ending feedback meeting can actually be very important. And then to that end, I think there's a very helpful list listed on page 322 of your book of some of the kind of things that you might want to ask. So, for example, what did we learn about the OD process? I think this is important both for the client as well as for the consultant. For the client, it's a way of assessing the degree to which you've truly transferred some knowledge to the client. For the consultant, this is kind of sort of like a lessons learned. And I think it's important that every consultant sort of keeps a log of things that they learn as a result of engaging in this process. And then there are many other sort of important questions that are listed on that page. Okay. So once again, it's just as important to think about how you're going to exit the organization as it is to think about, say, how you're going to begin with the whole sort of entering and contracting phase. Okay? So this was a relatively shorter session, but nonetheless a just as important session as any of the others. And once again, this session does conclude, this fourth step of the OD process. Once again, beginning with entering and contracting, then moving to the diagnostic process, then moving thirdly to the process of actually bringing about the intervention change, and then once again to this final process whereby we're concerned with sustaining the momentum, evaluating the effectiveness, and then ultimately how we're going to exit the organization. Okay, so that's all. Take care.